Hi, everybody. Welcome to the live stream. We had today day 20 of Alec Murdaugh's trial for murdering his wife and son. The trial has been going on for 20 days. The first 2 days were jury selection and opening, and now the state has been presenting evidence for 18 days. But today, they finally rested. The defense put up two quick witnesses, didn't really get anywhere. Today we got something really interesting, our very first tea from the jury. We'll talk about what that was. We also had Dick Harpootlian, the defense lawyer, managing to shoehorn in, not just once, but twice, the fact that Alec Murdaugh could be facing life in prison just for the financial crimes he did. And most of all, most importantly for the day, we at long last had a timeline, a real timeline, so people can start to put together the case. Now, I've taken the new information they talked about today, I've added it to my timeline, and we're going to be going through some of the key points. I'm going to show it to you on a timeline, and I've compared it to what Alec Murdaugh's claims, what he says he was doing, where he says he was, and we're going to evaluate it and see what we think about that. So one of the early things that happened today anyway was that tea from the jury that I mentioned. Yesterday, we talked about the fact that the judge suddenly announced that he had selected a foreman and that this foreman would now sit in the first chair, would be responsible for filling out the verdict form, and would be the one communicating to the court on behalf of the jury. Well, the first communication apparently came in yesterday, and the judge mentioned it today. The first communication was, hey, how come you picked the foreman? Why didn't we get to pick our own foreman? We thought we would, which actually was my reaction too. I had never heard of that before, but apparently this judge says that's what he always does. He appoints the foreman, and that was why he picked it. But he said no juror has any more authority than any other juror. Everybody's equal. This is just who the foreman is going to be. I can say I think it was maybe a mistake for him to do that. Just as someone who mediates cases as well, one of the things you would love for people to do is to reach an early agreement on something. So I think a jury that selects a foreman has gone partway toward making a decision together, unified, and might have an easier time deciding about the case. But in any event, that was our very first tea from the jury. They wanted to make their own selection on the foreman. If you wouldn't mind, please hit the like button. We'll get out to more people for this live, and let's get started. The first witness of the day was Ryan Kelly. Oh, we're so into this, we almost forget. What case are we talking about? Alec Murdaugh is a now disbarred attorney who is accused of a host of financial crimes, none of which are actually relevant to the main crime being prosecuted here, which is whether he murdered his wife and son. However, all of that has come in as related to his motive for killing his wife and son. So we have a lot of evidence about that here in the case. On cross-examination, Ryan Kelly, who was the senior special agent in charge of the side of the road incident. Now, you remember from yesterday, or if you're new, the side of the road incident is where Alec Murdaugh actually staged, according to his own admission, he staged a suicide, hoping to be killed by his cousin Eddie. And cousin Eddie was going to shoot him while he was changing a tire on the side of the road. The point of it being that then Alec's remaining son, Buster, would be able to collect there were different numbers, $10 or $12 million life insurance policy. And that might not happen if Alec Murdaugh were to kill himself. So he wanted assisted. That ended up, when he first released this information to the police and ended up in the hospital with a bullet wound to the head, but not at all dead, he said that a stranger had stopped by the side of the road, offered to help him change the tire, and then shot him in the head. Alec Murdaugh stuck to that story so hard they even made a sketch of the person, but then later confessed he had made all of that up. That incident was hotly contested. Is that going to come in? Is it not? But it did. It came in In fact, the judge himself went back and forth, in, out, and finally it was just all the way in. So Ryan Kelly was talking about that incident, and he said that Alec was talking to the officers. Well, the defense point was, okay, Alec may have been telling you all this stuff, but remember, he had just been shot in the head. And after all, he's also admitted he was on opioids and was given drugs by the hospital. The implication being, how much could you take this seriously? Because he had a lot of problems going on. They also tried to suggest that Alec Murdaugh had called voluntarily from detox in order to tell the truth. That sort of disintegrated on redirect, but it was still the case after we heard the interview yesterday from his detox that Alec Murdaugh did own up, fess up to a host of financial issues and didn't even try to hide them. He admitted, for example, that he stole money. He admitted that he used drugs. He admitted that he lied. He also, in fact, was charged with insurance fraud because of what he said to SLED during this interview from Detox. There was discussion too, and this is where Dick Harpootlian managed to shoehorn in this fact that he had 90 indictments that could result in financial, all related to financial fraud, and could face life without parole. Dick Harpootlian, the defense lawyer, wanted to get that in because one of the factors that probably is weighing in the jury's mind is this guy has done a host of terrible things. Can we just let him off? Maybe we have some doubt on the murders, but look at all this other stuff he did. And Harpootlian wanted the jury to know he's going to face consequences for that. It's not like he's walking away. He's got all of these criminal indictments against him. Now, that drew an objection that was sustained, but he still managed to say it twice. So it's still out there despite the objection. They also talked about an incident where the defense, where the SLED investigators told Randy Murdaugh, the brother of Alec, that they only wanted to meet with Alec just to show him a picture of a truck. And as it turns out, it was for a lot more reason than that. The implication from the defense was just that this has been a sort of hostile relationship, and you were just out to get Alec Murdaugh. Now we moved straight from there to Special Agent Peter Rudofsky, the agent who talked about the timeline. I'm going to give you the facts, the key facts that he added in or interpretations that he drew, and then we're going to get into the timeline right after that. First and most importantly, he added the GM data. When we first started the trial, the prosecution said that the GM had refused to produce information, or previously said they had none. But Alec Murdaugh's vehicle, his Chevy Suburban, actually did have data that was downloaded at GM. The FBI spent a year writing a program to crack the data on the Chevy Suburban, got some but kind of awkward data, no location information, for example, and just real awkward. You could just tell it was in park, it was out of park. It was very awkward data. GM, in the middle of this trial, produced brand new information. It is really altering the terrain of the trial. It's something that has benefit to the prosecution and benefit to the defense, and they're having to, on the fly, change some of their arguments and their strategy to adapt to the new information that just came out when the prosecution was frankly nearly through with its case, like at least 2/3 of the way through. The new information that came out then was that Alec drove faster on his way to Alameda, his mother's house, than he drove to work. Now, what are we talking about? Alec Murdaugh was at the house, Moselle, where Maggie and Paul were both murdered. He was there, and his alibi is he drove to see his mother. He wasn't there at the time that they were killed, but the timing is very, very close. It's just on the edge. And that's why it's so hotly contested exactly when he went, exactly what he did. So the argument is, look, he was keyed up. He drove faster than he did during the rest of the day. There was also testimony about the fact that Alec drove right by the spot where Maggie's phone was tossed on the side of the road. He picked up speed minimally after that, but the defense had a really good cross that really was pretty smooth. He was accelerating through that section of road. And so there was no pause. There was no like slowing down to throw, roll down the window and throw the phone out the window. There was nothing like that. And about 5 minutes later, he picked up speed significantly, but he was on a different road by that time. There was also testimony that he drove toward the outbuildings at his mother's house first. Was he thinking about discarding some of the bloody clothes or whatever he had with him? We don't know. But the implication was he didn't stop. And I was unclear, but I think they were saying he ultimately parked at the main house. Now, he stayed at the house for 20 minutes. There was some discussion earlier. He had testified he thought it was longer than that. The caregiver for his mother said it was 20 minutes, and the data shows 20 minutes. That's how long he was there. On the way out, you'll notice this on the timeline. I'd even already written this in, but he stopped for 1 minute on the driveway at Alameda. That would be just about the only time he had to get rid of either guns or bloody clothes, because he wasn't wearing bloody clothes when the police arrived. And the guns were still have never been found. The testimony then was that he drove even faster on the way back to Moselle than he had earlier. One of the most important things I thought was whether or not he went to the house first or whether or not he went to the kennels first. If he went to the kennels first, my view is that's pretty much an admission that he was saying he knew something was going on there, because his testimony, what he said in his interviews was when he got back from his mother's, he went to the house thinking his wife and son would be there. When they weren't, he went down to the kennels to check on them. But the kennels were a minute or so drive from the house. So if what he did instead was go straight to the kennels, to me, it would have suggested that he knew something was up at the kennels, and that's why he went there first. But the data shows he actually drove to the house first, and about 5 minutes later, then drove to the kennels where they had last been. He called 911 within 20 seconds of arriving at the scene of the kennels. Now, that was something the prosecution made a lot of fodder with. They said, look, 20 seconds. You said you went over, you touched the bodies to see if they were alive. You tried to turn them over. How are you going to do all that in 20 seconds, register your surprise, and still call 911? That seems really unrealistic to us. They also made a great deal of the fact that he called Rogan, Paul's friend, but the defense said, well, yeah, but that didn't happen until after he'd already called his brother. So those were the kinds of arguments they made. We got some new evidence in the course of this. One was a text from Paul to his dad, Alec, on May 6th, in which he said, I'm still in ED, which I think is Edisto Beach, because when you get here, we have to talk. He's still talking to his dad. Mom found several bags of pills in your computer bag. This was important because it showed Alec did have a drug problem, and Paul and Maggie knew about it. On May 7th, Alec wrote to Maggie saying, I'm very sorry that I do this to all of you. I love you. And the prosecution says that was his response to being confronted about having pills. On May 26th, which was 12 days before the murders, Maggie did internet searches for several kinds of pills: OxyContin, oxycodone, green gel pill, white pill. One thing that surprised me was if Alec Murdaugh had, as he told SLED in the interview, if he had had an 18-year addiction, that they were surprised that they found a bag of pills, that she was just then searching for these pills, seems like a surprise. Is it possible that after all that time, they were just now learning about his addiction? Hard to know. Impossible to know, in fact, but it did seem a little off to me. On June 3rd, then, which was 4 days before the murders, Alec Murdaugh wrote to Russell Laffitte at Palmetto State Bank asking for a $600,000 line of credit. And he said specifically, my dad will co-sign. That's the exact amount that he ended up paying back to Chris Wilson. So it seems like a very specific number. But oddly, that number was $192,000 short of what he needed to pay Chris Wilson so that he could reimburse his law firm for the $792,000 he had taken as a fee that was supposed to really go to the law firm. So on cross-examination through all this, and I'm going to show the timeline. It will be much clearer when I show you the timeline. I just want to get all the facts out so you have those, and then we'll look at the timeline. So hang on. The cross-examination pointed out, look, this was the same amount of time to drive to his mom's house each way. There's not a significant difference. Maybe he was just passing somebody, and that's why he accelerated a little. And it's very possible, they said, that when he was driving up to the scene, he could see Paul and Maggie's bodies, and that was the extra time he needed, not just the 20 seconds that it took him to stop the car and call 911. They also talked about the fact that the prosecution in its timeline had very selectively picked the data that included, and they left out a lot of data that the defense wants to put in. And I'm sure they'll have a witness who will do that. There were also some things that the state couldn't explain, and we'll get into those in the timeline, particularly with the cell phones, with Paul and Maggie's cell phones. So we then got into the directed verdict. That's pretty much a motion everybody has to make. Okay, we're going to have a directed verdict. And the defense says there's just not enough evidence here to convict our client, just dismiss the case. I saw comments from Georgia 1960, and we say howdy here, that it seemed pretty perfunctory, and I thought it was. I agree with you completely. Griffin made the argument. He just said, yeah, they don't have enough. And the prosecution listed what it had, and the judge said, look, we've had 18 days of direct and circumstantial evidence. Either is enough, and there's enough evidence for a guilty verdict. Pretty obvious, but definitely would have been the decision. The defense then, since the prosecution rested, the defense put up two witnesses. They were both quick and not particularly strong as the opening witnesses. The first was the coroner, who actually declared the time of death for Maggie and Paul. I imagine that this is something that they assumed the prosecution would put in. It probably was a surprise to them to have to do that, but he was not particularly strong as a witness. He said that when he got to the scene, and he got there pretty early, by 11:04, he went into the feed room, so he could himself have been responsible for the bloody footprint because the crime scene had not yet been processed. He put his hand in the armpits of Maggie and Paul to determine whether they were still warm. He checked for rigor, which starts within 1 to 3 hours after death, and they did not have any of that yet. He didn't do a rectal temperature, which would have been more precise. So, and he said strictly a guess that he thought they died about 9, but it could have been 8, it could have been 10, somewhere in there. So there was not a precise time of death. The defense then put up Shalane Tyndall, the Colleton County who works for the Colleton County Sheriff's Office as the lead public information officer. And she said, look, at this time, there's no danger to the public. Well, let me backtrack. They put out a press release, and she said that the Colleton County did it in coordination with SLED and jointly announced, at this time, there is no danger to the public. If information is received that dictates otherwise, we will immediately notify the public. And the defense wants to use that to say the police rushed to judgment. They immediately came to the conclusion, or the sheriffs did, they immediately came to the conclusion that Alec Murdaugh did it. They never even really considered any other potential suspects. So I think that they had to have been a little bit disappointed with her testimony, which was that they updated that release just a few hours later and removed the language that said, at this time, there is no danger to the public. Now, they never changed it and said, okay, there is a danger. Never did that, but they took out that part. So we are about to get into the timeline, and I think you are going to really enjoy this part because I think it's going to help make sense of a lot of the things that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. So if you would, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you're not subscribed. We're covering this case every day at 7 o'clock, and I would love to have you back for more. So let's put up the timeline and get going. Now, what I've done is, in order to kind of streamline this, because the timeline, this is just my timeline. This is not the state's timeline. This is a timeline that I put together to try to make it a little clearer for you. But I've tried to put in the evidence that they talked about today or that they've been talking about and pair that up with what Alec Murdaugh says as his alibi, where he was, what they were doing, and see whether they compare, because I think that's ultimately how we're going to have to read all of this. So in the first column, you'll see the time, and it's always PM. I got a question about that last time, but every time is PM, so I didn't add it each time. Then there is information. I initially put car and phone data. Now it's even more than that because there's, I guess, well, the GM data is still car data, but this is any kind of information we got. And then I've got Alec's story or any witness story kind of over to the right. So I want to just focus on the ones that I have in red because it's already a lot. And we've gone 21 minutes. So I definitely want to focus. I want to cover every one of these because I think they're the most important. One of the things that I thought was important is, and this may seem small, I'm sure it will, but Maggie and Paul were texting at 6:23 about Blanca Simpson, their housekeeper, having cooked country fried steak and mac and cheese. The reason why I think this is important is because Blanca Simpson had testified that she made cube steak and gravy, that could be the same, white rice and green beans. But then the coroner found no green beans in the stomach contents of Maggie and Paul. So that means that there's question about whether Blanca remembered correctly about the green beans that she said she made. Why does that matter? Because she also says that Alec Murdaugh was wearing a polo shirt when he left for work, and she's sure about it. That's odd because he's wearing a button-up shirt in the evening when he's filmed next to a tree in a video that Paul did, a Snapchat video. Why would he change into a button-up shirt after work? It just seems bizarre, and the prosecution has made a lot about the fact that, boy, he sure was changing clothes a bunch. So then let's move on down to between 6:52 and 7:02, Alec took 283 steps. That's pretty many. Why was he walking around? What were all these steps? Oddly, though, they also have Paul taking about 105 steps at about this time. Now, that would make sense if Alec and Paul were walking around the property, which is what Alec said they did that afternoon or evening. But oddly, at least I wrote this down and double checked it with another source. I wrote down that they had Paul arriving at Moselle at 7:04. I wondered if that time could be wrong because how is Paul taking 105 steps while driving? It seemed unusual, and it made more sense and would move the timeline back if they started walking together at, say, 6:52, 6:54, somewhere like that. Then at 7:18, Alec told C.B. Rowe to call him. Now, one of the things that's interesting about C.B. Rowe is there was some conflict between the Murdaughs and C.B. Rowe because he had supposedly killed an entire field of sunflowers, which were important for their quail hunting. And so they were having some conflict, and there was suggestion maybe he killed them. But all of the data that they showed us said that C.B. Rowe's telephone, his phone, was nowhere remotely near the scene throughout the evening. And so the SLED officers just considered him to not be a serious suspect. At 7:39:55 is the very important Snapchat video. That's where Alec Murdaugh is seen next to the tree, and he's wearing khaki pants and a blue button-up shirt. That video is what it is not the clothes he's wearing in that video. Those are not the clothes he was wearing when SLED arrived at something after 10 o'clock after he had called 911. At that point, he was wearing a white t-shirt and shorts. And the prosecution says he changed clothes in order to hide the fact that he had blood all over him. Where the clothes, they haven't shown up again. Blanca Simpson testified she had never seen that shirt again, but it was just a blue button-up shirt. And khaki pants were found on the floor in the next to the shower in the house. So perhaps Alec Murdaugh had taken them off to shower. It wasn't clear. Then at 8:08 to 8:14 and 8:14 to 8:35, I'm not sure why they split it out, Paul's phone was located at the house. That could match with what Alex said about the family eating dinner together. Also, they thought, the agent testifying thought that Maggie came home about 8:17 because she unplugged her phone. She was probably at Moselle. She took 38 steps. She probably walked into the house. So right about that time, it seems like they might have been eating dinner together. Now, afterwards is super important. You may remember Alec Murdaugh said after dinner, he took a nap, woke up, went to his parents' house and saw his mother, and then came back. The murders happened sometime during that span of time, and that is admitted. It did happen in that span of time. The prosecution agrees. But there is a video that Paul took at the kennels, where he and his mom went after dinner, and where they both were killed. And there's a video he took, and numerous witnesses now have testified that in the background, they could hear Alec Murdaugh's voice talking to Maggie Murdaugh. So that testimony so far has not been contradicted by the defense. They haven't suggested someone else was in the background or Alec wasn't there. We don't really know. Maybe they just plan to let it go, but they haven't said anything that would contradict it yet. So at 8:38, and we're getting closer and closer in time to the murders, at 8:38, Paul's phone is back at the kennels. At 8:44, Paul FaceTimed his friend Rogan. Rogan says to the officers that he thinks he hears Alex in the background during this conversation. But the call doesn't work very well. So Paul does what is something he and Rogan have always done when FaceTime doesn't work so well at Moselle, and apparently that was pretty common. Paul takes a video to show what he was talking about and then sends that because it will transmit. So in this case, Paul took what's called the kennel video of a dog. Now, Rogan was keeping his dog at Moselle. Apparently it was having some kind of trouble with the tail, and Paul and Rogan were talking about the tail and what they were going to do and seeing a vet and that kind of thing. So Paul takes this video. Normally, Rogan would expect that this video would be sent to him and he would be able to see what it was that Paul was saying. That would be the replacement for FaceTime, which wasn't working. But that video never gets sent. Paul never sends that video. And like I said, numerous prosecution witnesses say they heard Alec Murdaugh in the background. That would contradict what Alec Murdaugh said, because he told SLED, you can see it in the blue column, he was not at the kennels. And he said that numerous times. He was not there. Then at 8:49:01, Paul's phone locks for the last time. What that means is Paul never opens it up. It never registers his face or opens up to anything like that again. His phone was very low on power, so the defense has pointed that out. Could that be part of it? We can't be sure. Then at 8:49:26, Maggie unlocks her phone and reads a text message. So we can guess that Maggie is still alive at 8:49:26. Then at 8:53 to 8:55, Maggie's phone records 59 steps and various orientation changes. And that means like from here, from vertical to horizontal and back and forth like that. And Siri and the camera activate. The prosecution believes that in this period, she had already been murdered and someone was trying to use her phone. They picked it up. The camera did not activate because she was not actually the one doing it. So it was waiting for her face. It didn't recognize it. It didn't unlock. The defense suggested, well, maybe Maggie was trying to take a photograph of the killer, and that's why the killer took only Maggie's phone, because Maggie's phone was removed from the scene and Paul's was not. Maggie's phone ultimately was found on the side of the road, about 1.5 miles from the kennels and away from the house. It was the same route that Alec Murdaugh took to get to his mother's house. But there were really only 2 routes you could take out of there. You could turn right or left. There was one road in front. So that may or may not actually mean anything important. At 9:02 to 9:06, Alec took 283 steps. It seemed to me like we had to be missing some steps, because how did Alec Murdaugh get to the kennels? The last steps were before dinner, and yet here he is at the kennels. How is he going to have time? And I also had this question: if they're killed at, say, 8:53 to 8:55, and witnesses have said the person would be covered with blood who killed them, then how did he have time to get cleaned up before going to his mother's? And why were none of the clothes that the housekeeper found bloody? Those are all questions we don't have answers to. The defense says these 283 steps were because he was going to his car. And we don't think Maggie had died yet. We don't think Paul had been shot yet. So let's keep going down. At 9:03 to 9:04, Maggie's phone backlight goes on. At 9:04, and it could be because of this, Alec called Maggie to say, I'm going to my parents' house. I'm headed over. At 9:05, he called Randy Murdaugh, his brother. And then at 9:06:12 to 9:06:52, Maggie's phone orientation changes from vertical to horizontal. An incoming call from Alec was being made right then. So it may be that someone, according to the defense, that someone picked up the phone and said, oh, look who's calling. It's Alec. And they took the phone with them then and threw it out. There was the final orientation change at 9:06. Alec calls Maggie again, and at the same time, his phone connects to the SUV. The state admits that there was some motion of the phone between 9:06:12 and 9:06:20. The defense thinks that's very helpful to them, because simultaneously, Alec was walking 283 steps, but her phone was not walking 283 steps. So they say he can't have been carrying both phones, or they would both have registered 283 steps. Now, later in this period, her phone has motion and orientation, but not steps. The state says, look, his walking time isn't precise. It could have come at the beginning or could have come at the end, but they still can't really explain why her phone has no steps. No steps it would be to carry it to the car. The defense says, look, it just makes sense. The 283 steps are he's walking to his car, and he doesn't realize what's happening or about to happen back at the kennels with Maggie and Paul. Now at 9:08:36, Alec is in his car, and he passes by the spot where Maggie's phone is going to be found the next morning. He is going 42 miles per hour, and he's accelerating at a fairly continuous rate, the defense argues. He stays under 50 miles per hour for another minute. So it isn't as if, the defense says, he stopped or slowed down to toss the phone out. He just was at a steady acceleration rate. If he threw it out, then there was nothing to say that he stopped or threw it out along the road. The maximum speed he went was 74 miles per hour, and he went up to 68, 70 range, but he was on a highway. The prosecution wants to say he was going that fast because of the fact that he was so riled up because he just murdered 2 people. That's the argument I think that they want to make. Now at 9:08:58, Alec then texted Maggie saying, I'm on my way to my mom's. I'm going to my mom's house. The next red entry I had is at 9:22:06, because that's when Alec arrives at Alameda, his mother and father's home. And according to the prosecution, the GPS shows that he drove toward the outbuildings first. That would be significant. Maybe he would be hiding evidence, but apparently doesn't stop, but instead, if I understood properly, goes to the parking area that's beside the house. So it doesn't seem he hid any evidence then. There is, though, a 1-minute gap between then and 9:24 when he calls the landline at the house saying he wants to be let in. Could have been trying to get in, waiting for that, who knows. But at 9:31 then, Alec is not at Moselle anymore, where Maggie and Paul were killed, but Maggie's phone backlight turns on and off. He is now at his mother's house. And the defense says, why? What made that turn on and off? Because it's not Alec Murdaugh. That's their argument. And at 9:34, Maggie, Rogan Gibson texts Maggie to have Paul call him. Again, her backlight goes on and then off. There was no message at 9:31 that would turn it on and off. At 9:34, there was a message that would turn it on and off. Then at 9:36:20, Maggie, again, her phone backlight goes on. My understanding was they said it went off in a range of times as if they couldn't directly pinpoint that. I'm going to have to go back and listen to that because that was very confusing to me. But Alec now is at his mom's house. So does someone else have Maggie's phone? That's what the defense is going to be asking. And is this maybe when it gets thrown out of a moving car onto the side of the road, but not by Alec, who is already at his mother's house? Alec stays 21 minutes and leaves his mother's house. And then at 8:43, his phone connects to his SUV and the vehicle starts driving. The car pauses halfway down the driveway for about 1 minute. Now, and I had already written on the side of what I had said based on the side of this timeline, based on what the FBI had said, I'd already written only time Alec could have hidden evidence because it's the only time I saw. So he had about 1 minute. I imagine that were he to testify, he would say, I stopped because I was making a phone call or dialing or something. But that 1 minute is a pause right on the driveway. The SLED agents did not search the property there at Alameda for a significant length of time, I think months. So there was, it may not have been quite that long, but it was quite a while. So there would have been time when something could have been removed before they got to the property. Now, at 9:45, Alec calls Maggie's phone to say, hey, I'm on my way home. And at 9:45, he leaves the Alameda driveway and begins driving home. He texts her again at 9:47. And at 9:51, he's driving 74 miles an hour. He also texts and calls numerous people on the way and on the way back to and from Alameda. Now, the prosecution wants to say this was all part of creating an alibi. It's all fake. He just called them so they could say, yeah, I talked to Alec Murdaugh, and not because he actually had business with them. But Chris Wilson, for example, testified that he did have business with Alec, and they talked about real work that they were actually doing. According to the prosecution, during the period he was talking to or texting Chris Wilson, he was going 80 miles per hour, pretty fast. Then at 9:56 to 10:06, and it's a range, it's not always pinpointed with the steps, he walked 231 steps. Now, that he says, and the data showed, he went first to the house where he arrived at about 10 o'clock, and he pulled into the Moselle driveway, not into the kennels. And by the way, the prosecution mentioned at 2:59, Alec was driving faster than he had been earlier in the evening. So where he had been driving 45 miles per hour beside the place where Maggie's phone was, now he was doing 57 miles an hour there. I'm sure the defense will say, well, he was at the end of the road, not at the beginning, having just turned on it. We don't really know about that part of it yet. At 10:05, Alec did pull into Moselle, 5 minutes, and he calls Maggie. She doesn't pick up. He's trying to reach her. And at 10:05, he begins driving toward the kennels. At 10:05:57, he arrives at the kennels. The 911 call he places is just a bare 20 seconds later. He places one at 10:06:14 and 10:06:18. That is such a short period of time. And Alex said that at some point he touched Maggie and Paul. He was pretty sure they were dead. He had checked their pulses. He had tried to turn them, at least one of them, over. And he also said he picked up Paul's phone. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So this 911 call is a very short period of time afterwards. The defense says that's because, maybe his headlights let him see, illuminated what he was about to see. That gave him time to react. And I assume they would also argue that he didn't touch the bodies and all that until after he was already on the phone with 911, running around trying to figure out what had happened. I will say this, I'm going to do another video, I think, on the 911 call, because he does sound hysterical. And I think it's important to hear him on that versus the 911 call for the side of the road when he sounds far less upset, put it that way. So this 911 call went on for a number of minutes until he hung up to call many different people. He called his brothers, and he also called Rogan. That is Paul's friend, but also was the very last person who was texting or communicating with Paul. And the defense said, well, wouldn't that be kind of normal? The prosecution witness said, not at all. I don't think I would call my son's friends, my murdered son's friend. I would be calling my family. That's who I would call, or 911, but he did call them. So those are, now after this part, and I should have put this in red, at 10:18, I'll switch it over. At 10:18, the Paul's phone backlight came on. That was, and the last text on it that would have been visible would be the one from Rogan. That could well be what Alex said he was doing. Alex said what he did was he started to turn Paul over. The cell phone jiggled out of Paul's pocket. He grabbed it, he picked it up, started to do something with it, and then put it back, thought better of it, he said, and put it back down on top of Paul. And that's where it was when the SLED agents arrived. It was sitting on top of the back of Paul as Paul was face down on the ground. And but the phone light, backlight coming on, that could have been Alec Murdaugh picking up the phone. So I am super interested in what you think, and I'll go ahead and remove that. I'm super interested in what you think about this timeline. What do you think are the holes in it? Do you think that it's better for the prosecution, better for the defense? What do you think when you see this? We're going to be talking about it all week, so you absolutely want to subscribe. You don't want to miss a minute of this trial. It is up and down, crazy every day. There's something new every single day in this trial. It is really an interesting case and a very tragic one, because there is a man accused of murdering his wife and son. It's circumstantial evidence, and the question is, has the state proven the case? Does what we see here prove the case? Does this timeline prove the case? And I wanted to put it together because I think it makes so much more sense in a timeline setting, and particularly when you can see it, when you can actually see it laid out. How much time did he have between here and there? When would he have changed his clothes? If they were covered with blood, where was the time to do that? How would he have cleaned up? Where are the bloody clothes? And how would he dispose of them? How would he dispose of the guns? Because Maggie and Paul were shot with 2 separate guns. So that's going to continue to be an issue in the case. So be sure to like the video. I would appreciate that. And subscribe. I'd love to have you back for more. And I will see you at 7 o'clock on Monday. Oh, wait, they're not having trial on Monday. 7 o'clock on Tuesday.